The wind cut across the valley like thin blades, slipping through every seam of clothing and every gap between fingers. Selah Carter hunched low by instinct as she rode up the slope toward the small cabin at the forest's edge. The storm had come earlier than expected. Heavy flakes fell fast, striking her cheeks like hundreds of cold grains of sand. She only wanted to reach home, start a fire, and escape the cold burrowing deep into her bones. But then, in the swing of her storm lantern, she saw a shape. A figure slumped beneath an old cedar, shoulders curved, head bowed, a thin coat hanging off him as if it had long stopped doing its job. Selah's horse halted, its breath rising in short white clouds. She tightened the reins and looked closer. The man didn't move. Snow had settled thick on his hair and shoulders. If she hadn't noticed him, she might have mistaken him for a fallen log. "Good Lord," Selah muttered as she stepped down. She wasn't the sort who rushed to help a stranger in a storm, but something drew her forward, not pity, but a strange instinct, as if walking away would invite a wrong she couldn't undo. "Hey!" she called out, raising her voice over the wind. "Are you alive?" The man stirred, slowly. Then he lifted his head. For a moment, the wind seemed to fall silent. His eyes, tired, red from cold and lack of sleep, held hers in a way that made Selah freeze for a heartbeat. It wasn't a plea. It wasn't fear. It was the look of someone too worn down to pretend anymore. He tried to speak, his voice so hoarse it almost dissolved into the storm. "I think I'm alive." Selah dropped to one knee, her hand finding his shoulder. Through the cold, wet fabric, his skin burned like a man fighting a high fever. "Get up," she said quickly. "You'll freeze out here for real." He tried to rise, but his legs buckled. Selah caught his arm, and he slid halfway into her, his chest leaning against her shoulder, his breath warm against her neck in a sudden, startling rush. She stilled for a second. A man's breath. Hot. Damp, close enough to graze her skin. The wind howled, but all she heard was her own heart, slow and heavy. "Sorry," he murmured, his low voice shaking near her ear. "It's fine. Come on." She slid an arm around his back to lift him. He stood taller than her by a head, solid, but trembling like he had spent the night beside a furnace. Each time he leaned toward her, the heat along his body brushed across her skin in a long, quiet pull. Getting him onto the horse was its own ordeal. When she pushed him into the saddle, the collar of his shirt slipped against her hand. His fevered skin beneath the thin fabric sent a sharp shiver through her. She climbed up behind him, arms around his waist to hold him steady, her chest brushing his broad back as the horse began to move. Elias said nothing, but she felt his breath, warm enough to blur the cold air in front of them at the cabin. Selah nearly had to drag him down. His weight rolled into her, forcing her back a step, her hand finding his hip to steady him. He dipped his head, and his forehead brushed her temple, unintended, but enough to stop her breath. "Sit," Selah said, her voice lower than usual. He sank into the chair, hands shaking from fever and cold. She lit the fire, then knelt beside him to pull off his snow-soaked coat. As she peeled the wet fabric from his shoulders, her fingertips grazed his skin, hot, tight, and he clenched his jaw. "Almost done," she said quietly. He opened his eyes. Firelight touched his cheek, turning the depth of his gaze into something dark and steady like the storm outside. "What's your name?" she asked. He paused a moment, weighing something within himself. "Elias," he answered, rough. Elias Boone. The name settled in the small cabin, like the knock of fate on a door Selah didn't yet know was there. She set a pot of soup on the stove, filled a bowl, and handed it to him. His fingers trembled as he took it, brushing hers in a brief touch that lingered long after it ended. When he finished eating, his eyes drifted closed, his breath easing into a quiet, steady rhythm. Selah stood there, watching the stranger asleep in her rocking chair, his outline warm in the firelight, oddly peaceful. She didn't know why, but she knew this much with startling clarity. Tonight had opened something that would change her life. The next morning, Selah woke to the sound of harsh coughing from the outer room. The coughs came so hard, she thought his lungs might give out. She pulled on her coat, stepped out, and found Elias trying to stand upright beside the rocking chair, one hand gripping the back of it to steady himself. "What are you doing over there?" Selah asked, her voice rough with sleep. Elias tried to smile through shallow breaths. "I didn't want to trouble you. I figured I should leave." "Leave?" Selah planted her hand on her hip. "You're fevered so badly you can't stand." "I'm fine," Elias said, right as his shoulders trembled. Selah folded her arms and stared straight at him. "You're not dying in my cabin. But you're not dying out in the cold for being stubborn either. Sit." Elias didn't argue. He sat as if his body already knew he'd live longer if he listened to her. Selah handed him a cup of warm water. When Elias reached out, their fingertips brushed. A light touch, quick, but enough to make them both still for a beat. Selah placed the cup firmly into his hands, quicker than needed, hiding the strange warmth lingering in her palm. "You're staying," she said, "until the fever breaks." Not a question, a command. Elias looked at her longer than necessary, his gaze sharp from exhaustion, but warm and honest. "Thank you," he said, his hoarse voice turning the words into something more private. He meant to stay one day, but when the snow deepened and the fever kept its hold, one day became 3, then 5. Each day he tried to help Selah in some small way, though every step left him lightheaded. On the 3rd afternoon, Selah stepped outside and found Elias bracing an axe to split firewood, each swing ending in a raw cough that bent him over. "What do you think you're doing?" she demanded, walking toward him. "I told you to rest." "Resting all week. I'm starting to feel like dead weight," Elias said, trying to stand straight though he swayed. Selah snatched the axe from his hands. "And when you pass out in the snow, who's dragging you back? Me?" Elias let out a soft, strained laugh. "You're strong. Don't change the subject." But the corner of Selah's mouth twitched. She started to turn, but Elias caught her wrist lightly, a brief touch, yet it stole her breath. His hand was hot, his fingers rough, long and fitting almost too easily against her warm brown skin. "I just wanted to help a little," Elias said quietly. His voice was so sincere Selah couldn't stay angry. She eased her hand out of his, slowly. "Then do something light." That night, the cabin glowed with firelight. Elias sat on the fur rug, Selah only a hand's width away, both quiet as they listened to the wind scrape across the roof. A sudden gust rattled the doorframe. Elias tensed at the cold draft. Selah reached over and pulled a blanket across his shoulders, and as she leaned in, her hair brushed his cheek. His breath grazed the skin just beneath her collarbone. Selah froze. Elias froze. Neither looked away until Selah returned to her spot, slightly farther than before, but not far enough for her heartbeat to settle. With each passing day, Elias watched her more. The way she led her horse with a proud stance, the way she built a fire with quick, precise motions, the way she relied on no one but held a quiet warmth in her eyes whenever she looked at him. And Selah tried not to show how much she noticed him. The way his hand brushed hers when he offered a cup, the way his eyes followed her when she turned away, the way his breath sounded beside her in the evenings as they sat before the fire. They lived like two parallel lines, yet each day those lines drew closer, close enough that a slight tilt would bring them into touch. On the seventh day, when the snow had thinned, Elias stood at the doorway, gripping the wood frame, his voice tired but steady. "Selah." "What?" "I'll be leaving soon." The words fell light as a dry blade of grass, but inside Selah, they landed like stone. She didn't turn. She only said quietly, "All right." But her hand halted mid-motion in the wash basin, and Elias saw everything. Even if she didn't speak, he understood she had just felt something slip away. In the days that followed, the snow stopped, but the cold still cut deep into the air. Selah's small cabin, long used to quiet stretches of solitude, shifted into something different. Not noisy, just changed. There was the breath of a strange man inside it, the heavier steps he made, the scent of smoke and wood that clung to his coat each time he came in. They shared every meal. Morning was hard bread, and the coffee Selah brewed from grounds she always claimed were bitter as life, and Elias drank every drop without complaint. At midday, they sliced dried meat. In the evenings, Selah made stew, the one dish she never burned. Neither said it aloud, but both knew. The other's presence had become part of the day. On the 9th afternoon, Selah stepped outside to fetch firewood, and her ankle slid on a thin sheet of ice. She lost her balance, tipping sharply to one side. Elias was nearby. She didn't have time to cry out. He didn't have time to think. There was only the rush of his boots in the snow, then his hand catching her arm and pulling her into his chest. The pull kept her from falling, but brought them close enough that their breaths mixed. Selah's cheek brushed the collar of his shirt, catching the faint scent of pine smoke and wood fire, warm, undeniably masculine, enough to make her swallow hard. His chest rose and fell against her with breaths still uneven from running to her. "Are you hurt?" Elias asked, his low, hoarse voice at her ear. His warm breath passed along the skin beneath her jaw, stopping Selah in place. She needed 2 heartbeats before she could exhale. I'm fine." She said fine, but her legs felt less steady than usual. Elias didn't release her at once. She sensed the hesitation in him, as if he were holding himself back from pulling her in tighter than necessary. Then he let go slowly, though his eyes stayed fixed on her for a few seconds more. They both heard their own heartbeats. Another evening, with firelight spreading across the cabin, Elias stood to change out of a damp shirt. He turned his back, lifting the fabric. Only a second, but enough for Selah to see the long scar running from his ribs down toward his hip. An old scar, but deep. Not the mark of a simple accident. Selah froze, the wooden spoon in her hand stilled midair. "Elias, who did that to you?" Elias glanced at the scar, as if he himself had forgotten it was there. "Old story," he said quietly, pulling the shirt down. "Not important." But his eyes in that moment, hollow, distant, fixed on a place no one else could reach, made Selah's throat tighten. She wanted to ask more, wanted to know who had hurt him like that. But she knew some wounds could not be spoken of right away. She said only one soft line, "You don't have to pretend to be strong around me." Elias looked at her for a long beat. Firelight softened his eyes, but he didn't answer. He only turned and sat near the stove. That night, Selah cooked stew. She set the bowl before him. He lifted a spoonful, blew on it, and ate slowly. Before he could hide it, he smiled. A small, rare smile, just one corner of his mouth lifting, but enough to send Selah's heart sliding into an unfamiliar depth. "It's good," Elias said, low and honest. "Really good." Selah pretended to glare. "Only because you're hungry." "No," he said, shaking his head. "Because you made it." She laughed, bending down so he wouldn't see the flush rising in her face. But Elias had already seen. His eyes stayed on her long enough that Selah had to turn away to escape the tremor of being watched too closely. That night, the wind howled hard. Selah woke to a strange sound from the outer room. She sat up, threw on a coat, and stepped out. Elias was curled in the rocking chair, breath unsteady, sweat at his hairline despite the cold air. He was caught in a nightmare, shoulders locked tight, hands gripping the armrests hard enough to snap them. "Elias," she called softly. He didn't hear. The nightmare held him too far away. Selah stepped toward him. She didn't think anymore. She placed her hand on his chest, right over the heart beating wild beneath her palm. "Elias," she said again, as gentle as the wind. "It's all right. You're all right." His breath faltered. His shoulders eased, slow as thawing ice. His heartbeat steadied beneath her hand. In the dark, with the storm crying outside, Selah stood there, her hand on the chest of a man she never meant to care for, while her heart began doing the opposite. That morning, the snow had melted into thin patches of muddy slush clinging to every step and walkway outside the cabin. Selah and Elias had to clear the path together before the ice set again. They worked in silence. The only sound, the scrape of the shovel against the wooden boards. A sudden gust slammed down, flinging cold water up over both of them, their clothes soaked through. Selah shivered, and Elias coughed softly, his warm breath mixing with the sharp cold. "Get inside," Selah said, her voice shaking as water slid down her collar. "We'll freeze if we stay out here." They stepped into the cabin and lit the fire at once. Selah hung her coat near the stove to dry, while Elias pulled off his wet shirt, leaving only the thin undershirt clinging to his solid frame. Selah glanced for a moment, then turned away quickly, her heartbeat kicking hard. "We'll have to share this blanket," Elias said, pulling the thick fur throw closer to the fire. "Cold like this, sitting far from the stove won't help." Selah meant to refuse, but the chill sinking into her skin made it impossible. She sat beside him, their shoulders only inches apart. The warmth from Elias's body felt stronger than the fire. Flames flickered over her cheek, and Elias watched. He watched longer than usual, deeper than necessary. Selah lowered her gaze, pretending to adjust the corner of the blanket. "Don't look at me like that." "Like what?" he asked, voice low, roughened by the cold. "Like you know something I don't." Elias didn't answer. He simply gave a small smile, a smile that made Selah forget what she'd meant to say. When she reached for the cup beside the stove, Elias moved instinctively too. Their fingertips touched. A light brush, yet enough to make Selah flinch, and enough to still Elias for a long second. Neither pulled away. The air inside the cabin thickened, warmed, as if someone had fed the fire a fresh handful of kindling. Elias tilted his head. Selah lifted hers. The distance between them narrowed to a single breath. A moment stretched long enough for Selah's heart to leap against her ribs. But Elias stopped. He drew in a steady breath, meeting her gaze in the fire's amber light. "Not yet," he said quietly. Then he looked away. Smoke rose from the stove, steady and pale, but it was that pause, his restraint, that pulled Selah deeper into the man she had not meant to fall toward. That afternoon, the sky dimmed in a way that warned of something unwelcome. Not a storm, just a shift in the wind, heavy, carrying the scent of old snow and rotting wood. Selah walked to the horse shed to check the boards Elias had reinforced the day before. They were still new, but the morning wind had been stronger than she expected. "Easy, boy," she murmured to the horse stomping in its stall. She bent down to fix the hinge when a sharp crack snapped overhead. She looked up. Too late. The old stall door, hit by the force of the wind from behind, tore free of its mounting. For a split second, Selah felt the world collapsing toward her. But before the door could fall, Elias was already there. No hesitation, no shout. Just the sound of his boots hitting the ground hard as he lunged forward, arms sweeping Selah tightly against his chest, turning his body to absorb the full hit. They slammed together against the shed wall. Snow shook loose from the roof, sawdust scattered in the air. Selah couldn't catch her breath. Elias's chest pressed against hers, his breath burning against her cheek, as if all the warmth of winter lived in one man who held her close, shielding her with everything he had. "Are you hurt?" Elias asked, his voice low and rough enough to make Selah feel as if he were holding her heart in his hand. She couldn't answer, not from fear, but from being too close. So close she couldn't tell which breath belonged to her and which belonged to him. Elias still held her pinned against the wall, his arms forming a solid barrier in front of her, blocking falling splinters from her head. His chest rose and fell hard, his warm breath brushing her temple. "Selah," he said again, lower, softer. "Tell me you're all right." Selah lifted her face and their eyes met at a distance that no longer counted as distance at all. His eyes held the color of dying daylight, gold, dark, deep, and she felt herself pulled into them with no way out. I'm fine," she whispered, but her voice trembled. Elias heard everything. His shoulders tightened. His hand at her waist pressed just a little, enough to set heat rising through her body from the inside out. "Selah," he said, his voice almost breaking. "You make me—" He didn't finish. He couldn't. Because Selah had placed her hand on his chest for balance. Her palm rested right over his heart, beating hard, each thud sounding like a call. They stayed like that, close enough that one deep breath would bring their mouths together. Elias leaned in first, slow, certain. Selah lifted her face, not avoiding him this time. She felt his breath sweep across her lips. A strand of her hair fell against his cheek. He didn't move it. She didn't step back. The moment stretched so long, Selah truly believed he would kiss her. Really kiss her. Then Elias stopped, just a breath away. He closed his eyes, lowering his forehead to hers, enough to make her shiver, but not enough to erase the last boundary between them. "No," he whispered, voice cracking. "Not yet." Selah felt her heart drop into a soft, deep emptiness. Elias was the first to pull away, as if afraid he'd cross a line he couldn't undo. He stepped back, drawing in a long breath to steady himself. "If I stay close to you any longer," he said, eyes lowered, "I don't know if I'll be able to stop." Selah swallowed, throat dry as dust. "Then, why stop?" The question slipped out before she could hold it back. Elias flinched, as if she had struck the weakest part of him. He didn't answer. He turned instead, lifting the fallen door, setting it upright as though he needed something, anything, to keep from looking into her eyes. That night, the small cabin seemed to breathe with them, heavy, uneven, full of unsaid things. Selah lay in bed, unable to sleep. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the moment Elias leaned in, lips almost touching hers. Elias didn't sleep either. She heard him shift in the rocking chair, heard the low, restrained sighs of a man trying to hold something back that was breaking through him. Two people, two corners of the cabin, but their thoughts tangled together the entire night, and they both knew. Nothing that happened that afternoon could be undone. The snowstorm arrived just as dusk faded. Wind slammed against the cabin hard enough to rattle every plank. The windows shook with each gust, and outside was nothing but a thick white curtain with no path in sight. Selah fed more wood into the fire. She knew tonight would be colder than any night before. Elias stepped in from the porch, his coat coated in snow, breath coming out in long white streams. He shut the door firmly to keep out the wind, then stood still for a moment, as if steadying both his breathing, something deeper. "The wind's fierce," Selah said, wiping her hands on her apron. Elias didn't answer. He looked at her for a long time, as though every restraint of the past days had stretched so tight that one small movement might snap them. "Selah," he said, voice low, rough, worn down by holding back. "I don't know if I can keep my distance anymore." She let the cloth fall from her hands. Her fingers trembled lightly. "I don't want you to keep it," she said, direct, strong, true to herself. But her voice softened, thin as silk. "I'm tired of pretending I don't want what's right in front of me." Elias curled his hands into fists, like a man trying to hold back a wild horse. Then he moved toward her. Each step was heavy, slow, as though he forced himself to be careful enough not to frighten her. But Selah stepped toward him first. When only a breath stood between them, Elias stopped. His warmth rolled over her like a wave. "You know I've been trying to avoid this," Selah whispered. "But I don't want to avoid it anymore." Elias inhaled deeply. Then he set his hand on her waist, a firm touch, but trembling slightly, as though he had wanted to place it there for days but hadn't dared. "I tried," Elias murmured. "But you make it impossible." Selah looked up, and the first kiss came like that. Not rushed, not burning right away, but a slow surrender. Two people finally admitting they could not keep stepping back. His lips met hers so lightly, Selah wondered if she imagined it. But his breath was warm enough to erase doubt. She lifted her hands to his neck, pulling him deeper. The kiss lengthened, slowed, deepened. Elias slid his hand along her back, drawing her tight against his chest. Heat from his body moved into her like fire finding wind. Selah felt every breath he took, every faint sound in his throat as their mouths met. When they pulled apart, just barely, Elias rested his forehead against hers. I want you, he said, voice so low her whole body softened. But I don't want to scare you. I'm not scared, she whispered. I just want you closer. That broke the last barrier in him. That night, they belonged to each other. Not hurried, not frantic, only long touches, his hand cupping her cheek, her fingers tracing each solid line of his shoulder, each old scar softened under her gentle touch. Every scar she touched, he breathed deeper, like it was the first time someone had touched him without fear or curiosity. You're not afraid of my past? Elias asked, voice tight as her hand slid along the long scar at his ribs. No, she said, pulling him closer. I just want you to know you're not alone anymore. Elias lowered his forehead to her shoulder, his breath trembling, not from cold, but from the feeling of being accepted breaking him open. I never belonged anywhere, he said, breath warm against her neck. Not until you. Selah held him. He held her back, strong, deep, like his whole life had been waiting for this moment. When everything quieted, they lay together beneath the large fur blanket. The storm still howled outside, but inside the cabin was nothing but the warmth of two bodies wrapped around each other. Selah rested her head on Elias's chest. His heartbeat was steady and full, different from the nights she had to call him out of nightmares. Elias slipped an arm around her waist, pulling her closer. For the first time in years, both of them slept without feeling alone, without guarding themselves, without running. The snowstorm could tear at the world outside all night, but in his arms, Selah knew she had crossed into something she could never turn back from, and Elias knew this was the place his heart had been waiting to belong. Elias woke before the sky had a chance to lighten. Outside, last night's storm had slipped away, leaving a silence so deep he could hear the soft crush of snow under tree limbs when a gentle breeze passed through. The first pale light slipping through the window made the cabin glow faintly warm, like a long exhale after a violent night. Selah was still asleep beside him. She curled beneath the blanket, her soft hair fallen across her bare shoulder, one hand resting on his chest as if even in sleep she believed she had the right to touch him. Her breath warmed his ribs, steady, calm, making Elias want to close his eyes again and let himself drift into a peace he'd never hauled before. But he didn't close his eyes. He looked at her for a long time, too long for a man who knew he had no right to grow attached. His throat felt dry, sandy. He wanted to stay. God, he wanted to stay more than anything. Yet another thought tightened inside him. If she knew the truth, would she still lie here, leaning into him as if he were the safest place she knew? Elias brushed a loose strand of hair from Selah's cheek, careful not to wake her. His fingers trembled, not from cold, but from the knowledge that he had gone too far, too deep, too real. I don't deserve this, he whispered, so quietly the wind outside seemed louder. Selah shifted, leaning closer into him, like instinct, like they had been together far longer than a single night. Elias closed his eyes and swallowed a fear running down his spine. Selah woke as the sun crested the mountains. Soft gold light touched her cheek, and Elias lay turned toward her, eyes carrying exhaustion and something else, something she couldn't name. Good morning, she murmured, her voice rough from the long night. Elias nodded slowly. Good morning. Selah flushed a little, not shy, but warmed by the strange sweetness of waking in his arms. She shifted closer, resting her face against his shoulder. "I thought you'd be up and gone somewhere by now," she joked lightly, trying to hide the happiness she couldn't disguise. Elias gave a faint laugh, but it didn't reach his eyes. "No, I was just thinking." "About what?" The question dropped between them like a pebble into still water, rippling outward in thin circles. Elias didn't answer. Selah recognized the change as quickly as she recognized the sound of an unfamiliar horse approaching. He was pulling back. Not from her, but from the feeling he feared most. She pushed herself upright, wrapping the blanket around her, looking at him. "Elias, are you all right?" "Yeah," he answered too quickly. Selah touched his hand. "If you're worried about last night—" "No," Elias said at once, sitting up fast as if afraid she'd misunderstood. "It's not that." "Then what?" Elias fell silent again. His eyes drifted to the window, where early sunlight made the snow glitter. The muscles in his jaw were taut, like a bowstring ready to snap. "Selah," he said quietly, "I don't know how long I can stay." The simple sentence cut her harder than any wind outside. She didn't show pain, but her shoulders tightened, so slightly most would miss it. Elias didn't. "You're planning to leave?" she asked, her voice soft but thinner than she meant. "Not today." His voice was low, slow, tired. "But I don't know if I have the right to walk into your life the way I did." Selah watched him for a long moment. No anger, no blame. She simply placed her hand over his. The large, steady hand that had shielded her trembled beneath her touch and held her through the night. "I'm not asking how long you'll stay," she said honestly. "I'm asking, this morning, do you want to be here with me?" Elias looked at her as if that question knocked his whole world off balance. "Yes," he said, without hesitation. "I want to." Selah nodded. "Then start from there. The future. We'll let it speak for itself when it comes." Elias didn't know what to do with that kind of trust. It made him want to stay, and frightened him almost to pain. The morning passed in a strange, gentle quiet. The two of them eating breakfast together, Elias fixing the door, Selah making coffee. Everything normal, except for the long looks that carried unspoken things, the silences filled with too many thoughts. Selah felt it clearly. Last night hadn't solved everything. It had opened a new worry. And Elias, every time he saw her smile softly, felt himself standing on a thin line between happiness and fear. Both of them knew a cloud had appeared, but for that morning, they still stood side by side. That afternoon, the wind shifted, carrying the hard rhythm of hooves from the road leading into the woods. Selah was gathering firewood near the porch when she heard someone shout, "Elias Boone!" She froze. That name. She had heard Elias call himself Elias, but Boone, she had never heard before. She stepped into the yard, her heart dropping into an unfamiliar beat. 3 men were riding toward the cabin, their coats covered in road dust and thin sheets of snow. The tallest of them swung off his horse before it even stopped. "Elias!" he called again, breathless. "Finally found you." Selah turned toward the cabin just as Elias stepped out at the noise. She saw him stop at the top step, saw his eyes darken, as if someone had grabbed his heart and squeezed hard. The man took a step forward. "Christ, Boone, they thought you died in that fire at Trail Creek." "Boone," Selah heard it clearly. Not Elias the wanderer lost in the snow, not the stranger seeking shelter from a storm, but a name that carried weight. Elias clenched his hand, as if trying to hold the last pieces of his life together. "Don't call me that," he said hoarsely. "Not here." But it was already too late. The man finally noticed Selah. "And you are?" he asked. "Do you know who he is? This is Elias Boone, heir to Boone Rock Ranch, the biggest ranching empire Wyoming ever had before it fell apart." Each word hit Selah like shards of breaking ice. Heir, empire, collapse, and Elias had not said a single word of it to her. Not once. Silence dropped hard between them. Even the wind seemed to hold still. Selah looked at Elias, the man who had lain in her arms last night, breathed against her neck as though she were the only place he belonged. Now he stood frozen, unable to look her in the eye. "Selah," Elias said quietly, walking toward her, his voice unsteady. "Let me explain." "Explain?" Her voice broke out before she could stop it. "You lied to me about everything?" "I didn't lie." Elias lifted a hand, as if begging her not to shut her heart on him. "I just wasn't ready to tell you." Selah stepped back. "What's the difference?" Elias flinched like she had struck the weakest part of him. The other men stood silent now, realizing this was no moment for them to step into. "Selah," Elias said, voice tightening, "I only wanted to be a normal man in your eyes. Not Boone, not an heir, not the last survivor of a ruined family." "Then what am I?" Selah asked. "A hiding place so you can forget your past?" "No." Elias took a step closer. "You are—" "Don't say it." Her voice cracked. "Elias, you're not the man I thought." The words cut. Elias went still. His eyes emptied, then darkened. Selah turned toward the cabin. The heavy wooden door shut with a hard thud that made Elias flinch as if struck. He set his hand on the door, his forehead against the cold wood, breath breaking into short, uneven bursts. "Selah," he whispered, barely forming the sound. "Please." But she didn't answer. Cold wind swept across the yard. The three men stood together, watching Elias with quiet worry. "Elias," the tall man said gently, "you should talk to her." Elias shook his head. "She won't hear me. Not now." He turned back toward the cabin one last time. The fire still burned inside, the fire he once thought he belonged to. But now it glowed for someone else. Elias pulled his coat tighter around his shoulders, stepped off the porch, and walked straight toward the snow-covered road leading out of the woods. He didn't look back. If he did, he knew he wouldn't be able to leave. His boots left deep prints in the new snow, the tracks of a man who had just lost the only thing that made him want to start over. When Elias left the cabin, the snow thickened. Each flake hitting the roof struck Selah's chest like a reminder of the moment she shut the door on him. She stood behind the heavy wood for a long time, her hand still on the latch, breath caught high in her throat. Her legs wanted to open the door and run after him, but her mind stayed pinned under the weight of a betrayal she didn't yet know how to name. She didn't sleep that night. She sat by the fire, watching the flames flicker and twist like her own unsettled thoughts. At dawn, she heard a light knock, not Elias. The old blacksmith from town, the man who sometimes traded kitchen knives for goat milk, stood there. "You all right, Selah?" he asked when he saw the tired hollows under her eyes. Selah nodded. Though her hands clenched her dish towel so tightly, he knew something had happened. At last he sighed and sat down on the bench near the stove. "You know who Elias Boone is, don't you?" he asked, simply, as if it were something everyone knew. Selah's heart stalled. "I know the name," she whispered, "but nothing else." The old man stared into the fire, his eyes dim with memory. He used to own one of the biggest ranches in northern Wyoming, Boone Rock. Land so wide you couldn't ride across it in 3 days. His father built the empire, and Elias kept it steady for years. Folks said he was the youngest ranch master around who never lost a single season of stock. Selah went still. Not a wanderer, not a lost man stumbling through snow, but someone who had once stood very high. "But then," the old man continued, voice dipping, "he was betrayed. Someone he trusted most sold him out, signed one paper wrong, lost a whole lifetime for it." He paused, letting her picture the rest. The ranch was seized, the horses scattered all over the territory, and he exhaled, his fingers trembling faintly. He lost almost everything in one night. Selah felt the cabin tilt around her. "Elias never said a word," she murmured. "Not surprising," the blacksmith said with a nod. "He vanished after that. People said he went into the mountains to punish himself, for trusting wrong, for losing what his parents left him. Some said he went to die, but I don't believe that. A man hurting that bad, usually he just wants to disappear." Selah covered her mouth. A tear slipped down before she even noticed. Elias hadn't deceived her. He had collapsed and run. And when he met her, he'd chosen silence, not from contempt, but because he couldn't bear to see his broken pieces reflected in someone else's eyes. "He's a good man, Selah," the old man said gently. "Proud enough to let folks think he's a drifter, rather than let anyone see he's shattered. I think being here, with you, was the first time he felt safe in months." Selah lowered herself into a chair, hands trembling. She saw it all now. The first storm night, the warmth in his eyes mixed with fear, his body curled in nightmares, his silence whenever she neared the past. The pieces fit together like a picture suddenly lit from inside. "Oh God," she whispered, "I drove him away." The small cabin seemed to tighten around her. Selah rose abruptly and headed for the door without a coat. "Where are you going?" the old man asked. "To find him. He won't be easy to track. He always chooses the path no one expects." "I know," Selah said, her hand gripping the doorframe. "But this time, I'm not letting him disappear." Cold wind slapped her face as she ran into the yard, snow reaching her ankles. But her heart burned hot enough that the cold barely touched her. "Elias," she whispered into the wind, "wait for me." And Selah stepped onto the road he had taken, the road marked by deep footprints from a man who believed he no longer deserved to be found. But this time, she would be the one to find him. The winter wind struck Selah's face in sharp bursts, as harsh as open-handed blows. Snow lay so thick her feet nearly sank with every step. But she kept going. She didn't stop, not for a single breath. Elias's footprints from the night before had blurred under fresh snow, but Selah knew the direction he'd taken, the narrow path toward the mountains, where the pine forest stood still and unnerving, where no one walked unless they were trying to disappear from the world. As she approached the mountain slope, the sky seemed to sink lower. Light dimmed, cold seeped into her bones. And then, between the dark tree trunks, she saw a thin line of smoke rising from an old wooden shelter, the abandoned hunting cabin locals had used a few winters back. Her heart tightened. "Elias," she spoke into her breath, like a prayer. Selah quickened her steps. The door hung half open, wind slamming it against the warped frame. When she pushed it aside, the sight inside froze her completely. Elias sat slumped against the wall, coat soaked through, hands shaking uncontrollably. His face was pale, hollowed, lips blued by fever. His breathing was ragged, broken, like a man holding on to life by will alone. But what hurt Selah most was the look in his eyes when he saw her. Not joy, not relief, but fear. "Selah," Elias rasped, trying to push himself upright. "You shouldn't be here. I didn't want you to see me like this." She moved straight to him, voice trembling. "If I didn't come, then who would find you?" Elias shook his head, breath unsteady. "I didn't want to hurt you more. Leaving was the best thing." "No," Selah said, stepping closer, catching his arm when he nearly fell. "Leaving was the worst thing you've done." Elias shut his eyes, his face twisting with old torment. "I didn't want you to think. That night was a mistake." Selah softened. She lifted a hand to his cheek, her palm warm, his skin burning with fever. "Elias Boone," she said slowly, each word touching his heart. "That night wasn't a mistake. Not weakness. Not something I regret." Elias's breath stilled, breaking inwardly. He tried to turn away, but Selah held him steady. "I misunderstood you," she whispered. "You didn't deceive me. You just collapsed. And you were too afraid to let me see it." That was when Elias opened his eyes. They were red, shining with held-back tears. For the first time since she found him beneath the storm-bent tree weeks ago, he wasn't pretending to be strong. He wasn't holding anything back. He wasn't hiding. "Why did you come?" he asked, voice cracking in a way that tightened Selah's chest. "You deserve a man whole and steady, not a man who's lost everything like me." Selah didn't answer with words. She pulled him into her arms. Elias hesitated for a heartbeat. Then his entire body shook. The broad shoulders that once took the hit of a falling barn, door to shield her, now trembled like a child left alone too long. His arms tightened around her waist. His breath broke into quiet, shattered sounds she had never heard from him. She held him tighter. "Elias," she murmured into his hair, "I let you go once. I'm not doing it again." A hot drop fell on her shoulder, then another. Elias Boone, the man who once stood atop a ranching empire, lost everything in one night, walked into the mountains to vanish, was crying in her arms. And she let him. No rushing, no stopping him. Letting him know there was one place where he needed no armor at all. When Elias's trembling eased, Selah gently cupped the back of his neck. "Come home," she said softly. "Back to the cabin." Elias looked at her, eyes red but shining with something she'd never seen before. Open surrender to the woman who had made him want to live again. "Are you sure?" he asked, as if afraid the answer might shatter the last chance he had. Selah nodded. We start over, if you want to. Elias lifted a hand to her cheek, his fingers brushing the smooth, warm skin he had memorized on the storm-lit night. I want to, he said, quiet but certain. Selah smiled. Outside, the snow had stopped its furious fall, and on the trail back to the cabin, 2 new sets of footprints appeared, side by side, no longer abandoning one another. The snow melted slowly along the mountain slope. Every morning, Selah woke to the sound of water dripping from the ice slabs on the cabin's eaves, and the scent of damp soil mixing with fresh pine revealed after a long winter. The air still cold, but spring was coming, not with bursts of flowers, but with a gentle warmth drifting through the breeze like a quiet promise. Elias had come back to the cabin with her 3 days ago, and from the moment his boots touched the old wooden threshold, he began doing something Selah could not stop, no matter how many times she said, "You don't have to make things up to me." But Elias still did it. He repaired the wall planks, replaced the door hinges, refilled the woodpile, moving with the care of a man who wanted to build his entire future in one place. No half measures, no hesitation. Each nail he hammered in looked like he was sealing away the painful past behind him. While he worked, Selah watched quietly from the porch. Sometimes, when Elias turned to lift a board, the sunlight struck the scars on his shoulders and ribs, the same scars she had touched on the night they became each other's. They no longer looked like remnants of a dark history, but like honest creases of truth. He was a man who had been broken, and a man who chose to rebuild. She loved that about him. She loved his weathered pride. She loved the gentlest part of him, the part he had tried hardest to hide from the world. That afternoon, when the last of the golden light spilled across the pines and the mountain faded into pale amber, Selah stepped out to find him. Elias was kneeling by the porch, adjusting the front step. "If you keep fixing things, this cabin will look better than the town hall," Selah said, half teasing, half sincere. Elias looked up. A soft breeze lifted the dark strands at his forehead. "I want this place to be strong," he said. "So, you won't have to worry anymore." Selah walked closer. She knelt beside him, brushing a smudge of dirt from his cheek. "Elias," she whispered, "none of this was your fault." He caught her wrist, lightly but firmly. "I know," he murmured, "but I want to build everything again, from the start, right here, with you." The words fell between them like a warm spring current. Selah didn't even have time to answer, because Elias set the hammer down, exhaled deeply, and then shifted. He knelt fully before her. Selah froze. The air around her seemed to melt. "Elias," she breathed, her voice trembling. "You're—" "Shh." Elias looked up at her, eyes steady and sure. "Let me finish." He reached into his coat. When his hand emerged, he held a silver ring, not tarnished, not cracked. It gleamed as though it had been kept safe for generations. "It belonged to my grandmother," Elias said, voice soft as breath. "She gave it to my mother, and my mother left it for me, with one instruction. Give it only to the woman you want to build a home with." The evening light caught the ring, casting warm silver into Selah's eyes. She pressed a hand to her mouth as tears began to rise. "Selah Carter," Elias said, his voice low but unwavering. "I've wandered too long, lost too much, trusted the wrong people, and then feared trusting the right one." He held her gaze fully. "But you, You're the only place I've never felt lost. The only place that makes me want to stay. To stop running. Selah couldn't hold back her tears. They fell quietly, heavy as the snow that once weighed down the cabin roof. Elias lifted her hand and placed the ring in her palm. "If you'll have me," he said, "I want to belong to you, and I want you to belong to me. No hiding, no fear, no leaving ever again." Selah couldn't breathe for a heartbeat. Then she nodded, quick, firm, true. "Yes," she said, voice breaking with joy. "Yes, Elias." Elias pulled her into his arms, holding her as though the mountain wind might take her if he loosened his grip. But Selah held him even tighter, as if she feared letting go might make him disappear once more. They stood in the small yard before the cabin, the evening light fading, the snow around them sparkling like scattered gold dust. No witnesses, no finery, no ceremony. Just a promise as simple as the first spring after a long winter. They belonged to each other. 25 years passed like the grass that grew and withered on the slopes, slow, steady, and leaving traces for anyone willing to look back. The Selah Boone Ranch, once just a small cabin clinging to snowy hills, had grown into a stretch of land whose pulse could be heard from far away. Horses calling, hammers striking, children laughing as they ran through the late afternoon sun. Where there had once been only a single fire and 2 guarded people, there were now 3 children raised on the open wind. A firstborn daughter, quiet like Selah, but with Elias's stubborn eyes. A son who learned to ride before he learned to read. And the youngest, soft curls, quick laughter, as if life had never known storms at all. They grew up with the scent of hay, under green mountain shadows, and with their parents telling the story of that blizzard night again and again. The ranch was not always kind. There were years when rain ruined the grass beneath the horses' hooves, years of drought when the herd dwindled to half its number, years when winter froze everything, and the whole family slept in one room to save firewood. But there were also years of abundance, grass rising to the knee, barley shining gold, laughter carrying from the house all the way to the last fence line. Through all those years, good or lean, harsh or gentle, Elias and Selah stayed beside each other like 2 slow-growing trees whose roots had dug deep into the land. Every night, Elias walked one round of the ranch before coming inside, so regularly that the dirt path held his tracks deeper than anywhere else. Whenever he stood at the north fence and looked toward the mountains, he remembered the old wooden hut beneath the ridge, the place where he had nearly given up on himself, and where Selah had pulled him back into life. He had never forgotten. Not a single day of his life. On their 25th anniversary, the sunset lasted longer than any other evening. The sun slipped behind the range like a ribbon of burning red, and the breeze was mild, carrying the warm scent of fresh earth over the grassland. Selah sat on the long wooden bench on the porch, a shawl loose over her shoulders. There were threads of silver in her hair now, but her eyes held the same depth and quietness she'd had the first afternoon Elias met her in the snow. Elias stepped out, his hands still dusty from fixing the old stable. He sat beside her, saying nothing for a while, letting the wind touch them, letting the silence breathe slow between them like distant hoofbeats. At last, Elias spoke. "Do you remember that blizzard night?" His voice was low, drifting in the evening air. Selah turned her head, a small smile lifting the corner of her mouth, the same smile that had stayed with him his whole life. "I do. How could I not?" Elias exhaled, then slowly placed his hand over hers. His hand was more calloused now, but his touch was as gentle as the first night he whispered her name through a fever. "That night," Elias said, "you saved my life." Selah started to speak, but he shook his head, wanting to finish. "But everything after that." He looked at her as if every line of her face was a thank you he had never said fully. "You made it into a home." Selah closed her eyes for a second, just 1 second, to hide the swell of emotion rising in her chest. 25 years. So many arguments followed by long embraces. So many seasons, children, sunsets, and storms. And still, Elias's words made her heart tremble the way it had when he first leaned against her doorframe with that grateful, wounded look. She rested her head on his shoulder. Elias wrapped his arm around her as naturally as breathing. They stayed there until the sun dipped behind the mountains and darkness spread across the valley, not suddenly, not sharply, but softly, like a blanket being pulled up at the end of a long day. They had grown older, more silver in their hair each year, but their love was deeper, steadier, quiet as the soil beneath their feet, soil that had witnessed them lose each other, find each other, and rebuild a life from pieces that once seemed shattered for good. The sunset closed like a gentle door, and in the wide stillness of the west, Selah and Elias leaned into one another, just like the first day, but with a whole life carried behind them. If this story has touched your heart, you're welcome to share a comment. Perhaps a memory of the person who has walked beside you through the years, or someone you still hope to meet again. And if this brought you warmth, please consider liking and subscribing so the channel can keep bringing soft, earthy Western love stories to those whose hearts have lived through many seasons and still know how to be moved by something beautiful.